Here to dive into industry trends with leading ETF experts, this is ETF Spotlight with Nina Mishra.
Hello and welcome to ETF Spotlight. I'm your host, Nina Mishra. My guest today is Paul Dell'Aquila, Global Head of ETFs at Defiance. We're talking about the fifth generation wireless technology, or 5G for short, and related ETFs. Paul, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be part of your show.
Okay, so let's start with this. What exactly is 5G? I read that the International Telecommunications Union, which is a UN body, has a set of requirements for the technology, that it should offer download speeds of at least 20 gigabits per second, response time of less than 1 millisecond, which is basically zero response time, and the ability to connect at least 1 million devices in 1 square kilometer. So tell us, how fast is 5G compared with 4G that we have currently? And does 5G have the potential to change the world? Are we on the brink of a communications revolution?
Sure, and I think to scale it for your listeners, it's always helpful because people tend to throw out very big numbers with 5G, so I think it's the most important to scale it. So if you think about second generation wireless technology, that's essentially what brought around the capability to send a text message. 3G was able to bring you the ability to connect to the internet, and 4G is essentially what was allowed to watch a video over a mobile network. Right. Okay, so 5G is essentially taking us to the next evolution, which is really going to bring the central nervous system to some of the future technologies like augmented and virtual reality, telemedicine, robotics, autonomous driving. So all of these really cool technologies a lot of people have been talking about over the years, because of the lack of latency, because of the speed that 5G is bringing to the table, this is actually going to make these technologies much more mainstream and much more capable, where people can actually touch and feel and start to begin to play with these things.
Okay, excellent. So major telecom companies have just started rolling out 5G service in very limited areas. Verizon enabled the service last month in some parts of Chicago and Minneapolis. AT&T has started 5G service trials in parts of 19 cities. Sprint plans to launch the service in 9 cities by the end of this quarter. And looking at the handset makers, Samsung was among the first phone makers to introduce a 5G smartphone. Apple resolved its multi-year legal battle with Qualcomm just a couple weeks back. So maybe we'll see a 5G iPhone next year or in 2021. So tell us about the current status of deployment of this technology.
That's what I think is the most interesting thing about it. The buzz around 5G, it is one of the most talked about and searched topics on the internet. People on TV are talking about it constantly. And the very cool thing to me about this is that we are at the very early stages of this deployment. So I think you nailed it as far as the statistics. There's very few cities, 12, 15 cities where Verizon and AT&T has started to roll out some home capabilities around the 5G technology. The second half of the year, you're going to see a lot more phone makers bring out 5G cell phones. You're right, Apple, it looks like they're going to be a little bit delayed as far as iPhone goes, but nonetheless, it will come. And you're starting to see it. Some of my friends in the industry have sent me pictures of their cell phone and the 5G starting to pop up on their cell phone. So there are people who are beginning to experience it. But it really is going to be a second half of 2019 where you start seeing a little bit more. 2020 is the year that we're looking at as something that's going to be a little bit more tangible for investors, where they can start to play with the technology and see it in a more of a robust rollout. And that's why we look at something like our FIVG ETF. We don't look at this as something that investors are going to want to trade. We look at this as an investment. If you believe that this technology is going to be changing the world, as many people have pointed towards. This is going to be a multi-year story. It's not a 2019 story. It's not a 2020 story. It's a several-year story and beyond, where we think this capability is going to be impacting the way we work and live, quite frankly.
Okay, so as you pointed out, we are still a long way from the technology becoming mainstream, but its impact is going to be enormous. So tell us about
And you
5G.
actually, if I could just touch on one earlier point, you
Sure.
actually mentioned the kind of the global standard that people are talking about,
Yeah.
and I think that's an important note because it's not just the U.S. I mean, President Trump a couple weeks ago was adamant about the fact that 5G is a very big part of what the U.S. is going to do. That we're going to be a leader as far as the deployment as well as the securitization of this technology. But if you look at it, and that's the important note there is a global standard here. It's one of the first times that a technology like this is all being looked upon across the major governments of the world. So there is a uniformity around this, and there is some consensus that this is a very big deal across the entire globe. So that is what I think separates this from a lot of the other things as far as technological advancements. There's a uniform standard, and just about everyone, whether you're a mobile network operator or a government, is focused on the rollout of this.
Okay, great. So tell us about 5G's global value chain, because as you mentioned, it's a global technology, and which companies, industries, what kind of industries stand to benefit most from increased adoption of this technology?
Sure, and you're going to have some of the more obvious ones, right? Verizon, AT&T, they're touting it very much on their commercials and whatnot, and we have that. And that's why I think an ETF, something like our FIBG, makes sense because there is a very robust ecosystem that's going into this build-out. It's not just going to be one company that solves the solution of 5G. So if you look inside of our fund, we have about 22% in semiconductors. So companies like Xilinx, Skyworks Solutions, that are actually making some of the semis that are going into the technology to roll out 5G. So it's part that. It is mobile network operators, the Verizon, the AT&Ts of the world, that are going to actually be really bringing this technology to the consumer and charging for data plans, things of that nature. So those traditional telecoms. But you also have a lot of infrastructure that's going to be built out. So we have REITs in our portfolio as well. So there is going to be more cell phone towers. To your earlier comment, there's going to be a lot more devices. So if you actually look at it, smartphone data traffic, and this was a report from Goldman Sachs, we're going to see a 10x increase from 2017 to just 2023. So if you think about how many people use their cell phones in 2017, there's going to be a 10x increase on that, according to their report, in 2023. So these antenna and these cell towers have to handle a lot more traffic. So we have REITs in there that are going to be part of that to build that out. And we also have the chip manufacturers for the cell phones. Those are going to be a big part of it as well. So the actual delivery of the devices. So we have a very robust portfolio that shares some of those more growthy aspects like semiconductors. But we also have some of your more traditional telecoms like the Verizons and AT&Ts and REITs like American Tower. So you are going to have some income with our fund, but you're also going to have ways to play that as far as growth as well.
Okay, so let's talk about your ETF, and you mentioned about it, the Defiance Next Gen Connectivity ETF, ticker FIVG or 5G, great ticker symbol.
Thank you.
So it's the first ETF which is focused exclusively on 5G. Tell us how stocks are selected and weighted in the index.
Yeah, so we follow what we call an adjusted market cap weighted methodology because many of the big companies, they're the ones that are going to be rolling this technology out. They're the one with the capital expenditure to be able to do so. And as I said, it is going to be a big commitment from these companies. So we looked at really two things. Who are going to be the leaders in some of the spaces that we'll talk about in a second, so how we thought about building out the fund. But secondarily, what management teams, what CEOs, who's really committed to this space? And I think as we go over some of the holdings, if you listen to any of the past earnings calls, all of the CEOs, all of the management teams for these companies have all expressed 5G as a big future catalyst for their growth. So the way we looked at it in constructing the product, as I mentioned a moment ago, we included things like what we call core equipment. So it's radio access equipment that actually sends the frequencies out. It is the semiconductor, so that's a big part of it. That's our biggest component of the fund. We also have the mobile network operators, like the AT&Ts and Verizons, as well as those REITs that I was talking about. We have a third grouping that is also going to be focused on network optimization. So if you think about like Cisco systems, they're a big name in our fund. And our fourth grouping is going to be the chips for the cell phone. So a lot of the chip manufacturers, enhanced mobile broadband is what it's called. But we have a four grouping system. Again, we follow a market cap weighted methodology. But our fund rebalances twice per year, in late June and in December. And what we do at each rebalance, we cap the max weighting any one name can have in our fund to 5%. We didn't want, as we get into these smaller subsectors of ETFs, we didn't want the biggest names driving the overall performance of the fund. So we think about the world a little bit different than most ETF providers. Traditional cap weighted, it absolutely has a place in a portfolio. But when you start to slice and dice things, you get a little bit more narrow and a little bit more focused. We don't want just the FANG stocks and some of those big boys driving the overall performance of the fund. So we made sure that we capped it at 5%, so you have diversity across this entire ecosystem that we're trying to build into, and it's a very balanced approach to be able to play 5G.
Okay, so I'm looking at your fund and looking at the geographic breakdown. U.S. accounts for about 79% of the portfolio. Rest is international. And that surprised me a bit because, as you also mentioned, many countries, Asian countries in particular, China, Japan, South Korea, they are investing heavily in deployment of this technology, and with a lot of support from their governments in some cases. China, for example, has identified 5G as a strategic emerging industry in its 5-year plan. And of course, US wants to be a leader in this space. I'm looking at the holdings. I see that Xilinx is the top holding. Xilinx, Comscope, Skyworks, Nokia, Ericsson, these are among the top holdings. So could you tell us a little bit about some of the top holdings and also about the geographic breakdown?
Sure. So to my earlier point, the U.S. we look at, and I think, as President Trump has said, is going to be a leader in this space. I think we've done a good job of capturing that. You did mention global exposure, and we do have some of that with Nokia. We have that with Ericsson. China Mobile is actually one of our holdings. Another company that a lot of people point to, and they ask, why isn't it in there? Something like Huawei, that's actually not publicly traded. Right. So in order to create an ETF, you need to be able to access that in a public market. So a company like that, we wouldn't be able to buy for our ETF. The other thing that we did with our fund, we're offering it up at a relatively attractive price point, very competitive at 30 basis points or 0.3% for some of your listeners. And what we did is we kept any international stock that trades in ADR. We have it in the portfolio that we feel best represents that 5G ecosystem. If they don't trade in ADR, we did not want to go out to the local market and actually purchase those securities because cost of trading and cost of hedging goes up as that goes up. And we wanted to offer this up at a very attractive price point. So we feel like we've done a very good job of capturing the leaders in the spaces. Are there a couple companies out there that we would include when they trade in ADR? Sure. But I think what we've done is capture the majority of what we wanted to with the way we've structured the product. And again, we've done it at a very competitive price point of 30 basis points.
That makes sense. And I would definitely say that 30 basis points for a thematic ETF is really attractive. Most thematic ETFs, they charge around 60, 70 basis points. So I think that is probably one of the reasons for success of this fund. This launched in March this year. It already has gathered more than 79 million in assets. So probably pricing is one of the factors. And of course, investors do understand the potential for 5G technology. So that is also probably responsible responsible for investor interest in this area?
I think it's a lot of those points. I think we've captured something at the right place, right time, for sure. This is one of, like I said, the most talked about things out on the internet, period. But if you speak in the technology world, it's probably the most talked about. And I think we've created a very quality product at an attractive price point. So fees are always in discussion. I don't think it's the only decision or it's the only thing that people should look at when they make an investment decision.
Yeah.
But it is an important part. We recognize that.
Right. So 5G will enable handling massive data volumes at very high speeds from billions of connected devices. So it's going to provide a big boost to the Internet of Things. And another area which will benefit a lot from 5G technology is virtual and augmented reality experiences. And you have an ETF which focuses on augmented and virtual reality technologies. So tell us about that ETF. The ticker is AUGR.
Sure. So what we try to do with AUGR is focus on companies that are some of the leaders in that augmented and virtual reality rollout. Again, you are going to have some of the bigger players like a Facebook because they own Oculus, which is one of the more common headsets that people are using when they have this experience. But we did equal weight that fund so that you have a very balanced approach again and not have any one or two names dominating the performance of the product. So we have a very diverse way, and it's really looking at some of those future technologies with a focus on augmented and virtual reality. And to your point, I think 5G is going to be a catalyst to really open this up because I think most people's experiences with augmented reality goes back a few years ago when people were chasing Pokemon around the city or wherever they might have been. I would even go one step further that most people's first experience with augmented reality was the NFL when they first put the first down line on the football field. So anybody who watches football, that yellow line, that's the first augmented reality experience on the mainstream. So it's been around for a long, long time, but 5G, because of the speed, because of the lack of latency, is going to be able to bring this more mainstream. And what you're actually seeing now, there's actually a great video on our website that we have in our news and media section. It'll actually demonstrate a doctor performing a robotic surgery. So in other words, using some sort of augmented reality headset to be able to perform a robotic surgery in a remote place. So in other words, the doctor's standing in one room, the patient is in another, and through the use of 5G, through the use of augmented virtual reality and robotics, they're able to perform a remote surgery on a patient, which is just mainstream thinking as far as a breakthrough, because if you think about that, a doctor in Boston can be performing a surgery as someplace as remote as China, Africa, India, and some of the more remote places where they might not have access to the healthcare that they do in the United States. So that's sort of the breakthrough we're looking at. I think most people think augmented virtual reality is sort of a gaming thing, which it absolutely is. But there are going to be some very practical uses for this, and things like telemedicine, firefighters being able to use headsets and masks to help identify hot spots in houses and apartments when they go in to fight fires. So there are some very capable technologies coming that are going to be much more practical for people who use them.
Okay, very interesting. So I'm looking at the ETF, and this looks more international. U.S. accounts for about 47% of the portfolio. Japan is number 2 at about 17% of the portfolio, and which makes a lot of sense because Japan has been such a pioneer in robotics and also augmented and virtual reality technologies. And I see.
And you do have gaming too. So if you think about a company like Nintendo, that's one of our biggest holdings in that fund, and Nintendo is absolutely a leader there. As I mentioned, the Pokemon craze a few years ago, but they're doing a lot in that for the gaming world. So there is a gaming aspect to this fund, and certainly gamers. If you play video games, there's a lot of neat capabilities for those types of folks with augmented and virtual reality.
And this has an expense ratio of 40 basis points, which I would say is still very attractive.
Correct. It's very competitive, and that's what our thinking is. We want to build ETFs for the next generation with Defiance. That's what we're built off of, and we want to offer up ETFs that are at an attractive price point for investors.
Okay, great. So anything else investors need to know about 5G technologies or your ETFs?
We do believe this is going to be one of those breakthrough technologies where we're going to be talking about it for years to come. And if this is something you feel is a fit in a portfolio, FIVG I think is a very good place to play that. And understanding that this might not be something that you're really going to experience in this year. But if you're looking at the bigger picture and you're looking at 2019, beyond 2020, et cetera, this is a very good investment in our eyes because it is going to be something that is going to be changing the way we work and live.
Excellent. So that's all we have time for today. Paul, thanks again for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on your show.